So, hi everyone. Yeah, exactly. Recording. So first, I just want to acknowledge that the land that on which we are on today, for those in the room, is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. I am introducing Andrew Jorgenson today. So, Andrew Jorgenson is a professor of sociology here at UBC and a faculty associate at IRES. He is also the founding director of the Climate and Society Lab and a faculty affiliate of both the Center for Climate Justice and the Climate Solutions Collective at UBC, among many other hats that I didn't write down here. But he is an environmental sociologist trained in global political economy. He conducts macro comparative research on the human dimensions of global and regional environmental change with a focus on the societal causes and consequences of climate change. And so I will give it to him.
Just going to try to put this on really fast. And thank you. You actually just covered the first 5 minutes of my talk. So I appreciate that. Those kind of awkward self-introduction things that you do. So thank you for doing that for me. Is that mic placement? Is that okay for the Zoom? Hey, someone on Zoom, could you let us know if you can hear us okay or not? Assuming it's okay. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started unless hear otherwise. So thanks. Oh, yeah, thumbs up. Okay. I'm really excited to be here. We tried to do this earlier in the year, but my family kept getting colds. We have kids, and so I think a lot of us had a pretty rough cold year this year. And so here I am, and thanks for letting me reschedule. I'm really delighted to be here. I've been at UBC for a couple of years, and I've been really eager to get more involved and get to know folks over in IRES because I feel like there's a lot that I could learn from all of you. And I have a lot of interest in the work that's being done here by faculty and students. And, I'm way over on the other side of campus. And so ironically, up until a couple of months ago, I was just living right over here in the faculty temporary housing where I could just walk over to your building in like 5 minutes. But then there's been a lot of changes lately. Then my family got our PR status, which is exciting for us. And then we moved way to the top of Lynn Valley in North Van. And then right about the same time, some of you might have heard the big news about the sociology department. We've been relocated out of the ANSO building, and we're in the amazing Ponderosa complex while they're redoing our building. And all of this stuff has happened like in about a month or two's time. And so lots of routine changes. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here and to share this work. And I'm going to tell you from the onset that rather than I did this on purpose, given that it's late in the year, rather than giving you a talk that's a deep dive into one study where it's very technical or deeply theoretical, that's not what I'm doing today. I'm going to give you kind of a bird's eye overview of the punchline of 4 empirical papers that are bundled together within this common theme that we think, my colleagues and I, we think are starting to tell a rather compelling true story about the role of militarization in the climate crisis. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And I'm going to try to do it in about 30 minutes or so because I've been told to keep it to that point. But I'm happy to take questions as I'm going along and to keep this as informal as you'd like. So you already heard about the Climate and Society Lab, but I'll just say a few more things because I'm really proud of our team and some of my collaborators that are students are here today. But this is something that I've been kind of working on here at UBC since I arrived 3 years ago. And we're really like other labs, we're an incubator for collaborative research and mentoring. And as you heard, we do work on the societal causes and consequences and solutions to the climate crisis. We're grounded really in the discipline of sociology, but everything we do is very interdisciplinary as well. A big chunk of the work that we do focuses on anthropogenic drivers of environmental change in general, but in particular anthropogenic drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. This has kind of been my main area of research broadly for the last 25 years or so. And this has been a big focus of the work that we're doing here within the context of the lab. And we collaborate with folks all over the world, a lot of my former students that are faculty and across North America and Europe and Asia. And also, it's kind of generational. Also, my mentors from graduate school are part of it too. So it's been a really neat experience. If you don't really know much about the anthropogenic drivers literature, which is fine, we all have our literatures. But if you would like to take a look at some good synthesis pieces, because this is a very interdisciplinary area of research. There's the physical driver stuff too in the physical sciences. I'm part of the social science community that studies anthropogenic drivers, right? So here's just an example of a couple of these synthesis review pieces. One is a few years old, but it's a very interesting interdisciplinary group where we learned a lot from each other. And then this other chapter here is something that some of my current and former students and I just did that is a narrow focus, but more of a deep dive focus on things, including the role of militarization. And so just to give you a sense more broadly of the kind of work that we do too, because most of our research involves statistical analyses of social and environmental data sets. And I know that's a common thing for a lot of folks here at multiple scales and through time. And to give you an example of the different projects that I'm a part of that we have going on and the different scales, this is a paper that's in the current issue of American Sociological Review where the dependent variable is plant level emissions for fossil fuel power plants, where we look at how affective polarization in democracies around the world, different pathways through which they shape emissions at the plant level in democracies all over the world. And the shorter answer is effective polarization does matter. And a different area of research that's more broadly focusing on big questions about decoupling between economic growth and carbon emissions. This is a cross-national study that just came out very recently in the journal Social Forces, where Ryan Toombs, my former grad student and superstar at Penn State, and I focus on how different stringent climate policies might be able to effectively decouple economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions for especially global north nations. And the punchline is it depends. And so different units of analyses, power plants, nation states, and then in a current ongoing project here that we started once I arrived with some funding from SSHRC, we're focusing on drivers for Canada's provinces within and across Canada's provinces. And this we have the newest paper in this stream of work is forthcoming any day now, an environmental impact assessment review, where the key punchline is we find that, in literature that focuses on income inequality and carbon emissions, which is a big area of research, we tend to focus on the high income earners, but actually we find some evidence that if you shift and increase disposable income shares for those lower distributions within the income distribution, it can actually lead to decreases in provincial carbon emissions. And this also applies to different sectors. And we think this is really interesting stuff, but it's at the provincial level. So different scales of analysis. But today I'm going to talk about militarization in the climate crisis. How many of you have thought about militarization in the climate crisis before? Yeah. I think a lot of us have for a lot of reasons, and we're certainly not the only folks in the social sciences that are interested in this broad topic. A lot of the work, this is just sort of a snapshot of some of my favorites, right? Representative. I'm a big fan of the work that Patrick Bigger and colleagues have been doing. They're very descriptive work. This is a piece in One Earth that just came out. Highly recommend it. Also, Netta Crawford's really important historical analyses, descriptive analyses of military missions for the US military has really influenced us, like the sort of specific things, but also you have these broader kinds of things occurring in, these fancy journals like Science and Nature, where you see these kinds of commentaries and really important pieces about concerns about the climate being a threat multiplier, right? And how it can be a threat multiplier for future and enhanced conflicts of different kinds and vice versa. And then just the broad questions about are military sustainable, whether we're talking about the climate crisis or other sustainability types of questions. So it's out there. A lot of the work focuses on the climate impacts or the energy impacts or the environmental impacts of warfare. We're thinking more broadly from an institutional perspective. What are the potential impacts of the world's militaries on leading to growth in carbon emissions? This thing here was part of my master's thesis a very long time ago, just to give you a sense of my longstanding interest in the role of military or coercive power and its impacts on environmental change. I was a big fan of path analysis a long time ago. And so, you can, the arrows tell the story in a sense. And so I was looking at how military expenditures might be associated with the ecological footprints of nations. So this is an idea that I and my colleagues have been thinking about for quite some time, and it's continued to evolve. In this broader work, you heard that I'm trained in global political economy within macro sociology. And so this work that I'm going to talk to you about today is really influenced by a lot of big thinkers in political sociology and political science and global political economy. Charles Tilley, Chris Chase-Dunn, who was my mentor in graduate school, Michael Mann, Jeffrey Kenter. In various ways, they think about the role of militaries as a form of coercive power and the intersections between military and the state and the economy and so on. So we're really influenced by these big areas of really rich historical and theoretical work, which is influencing what we're doing. So as I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on like the punchline of 4 empirical papers. And in the first, I'm going to talk to you about work that suggests that the capital intensiveness and size of militaries have short-run and long-run effects on nations' carbon emissions. Then I'm going to move on and talk about related work that suggests that the impact of economic growth on emissions is greater for nations with larger and more capital-intensive militaries, these sort of moderation or amplification effects. And then I'm going to talk about further related work that suggests that capital-intensive militarization to some extent shapes what we refer to as carbon load displacement from the global north to the global south. This is getting into big debates that have been going on for 50 years about the impacts of foreign investment on the environment and the transnational organization of production and kind of critical globalization studies more broadly. And this is all cross-national stuff. But then, time permitting, I will focus on the US military, and where recently we obtained data from the US military on their own direct energy consumption, where we do a time series analysis where we find that minor reductions in US military spending could lead to substantial decreases in their direct fossil fuel consumption. I should also note, did anyone read the news this morning? Is there anything that we heard about Canada today in the news that might be related to this topic? Yeah. Yeah, the 2%. Does everyone know what we're talking about? Yeah, so now we've hit the NATO kind of threshold through various ways, the 2% cutoff, I guess officially as of today, or they made the announcement today. And so I just, by coincidence, I didn't plan this, right, to talk about this today, but wow, what a coincidence. Okay. So in this research, we are largely focusing on 2 different broad characteristics of militarization as a concept, as a set of processes that we operationalize as variables to do our analysis. The first is this thing referred to as a capital intensiveness of militarization. We operationalize this using a variable that Jeffrey Kenter came up with in his dissertation a long time ago, referred to as military expenditures per soldier. So if you're familiar with like military data from CPRI, we're using CPRI's data to create these measures. And so it is what it is, and we suggest that it captures the capital intensiveness of nations' militaries. We also include a measure of the relative size of militaries, so we're getting at the capital intensity and the relative size of militaries, and we use a very well-established kind of old school measure of size, military participation rate, which is personnel as a percent of total labor force, which we suggest, like others have suggested, captures other unique characteristics of militaries. Now, don't take my word for it. I could send you our data sets and you can look at the correlation matrices. These 2 variables are very weakly correlated with one another. So empirically, that suggests that they're capturing different characteristics, right? Because they're very weakly correlated. There are other military measures we could use, or you could use, and we have. That's why some of our papers are very long. And we believe that, or we think that for substantive and theoretical reasons, we really like to focus on these 2 because of how far-reaching they are. In most of the research that I'm going to present findings from, for those of you that are interested in quantitative methods, most of what we're doing involve dynamic panel models or kind of basic autoregressive distributive lag models with lots of fixed effects, elasticity coefficients, lots of control variables, lots of robustness checks, lots of sensitivity analyses. This is, the world that we're living in, right, when we're doing empirical social science. But I'm not going to throw all of those details at you today, but do know that all of that stuff is part of what gets to these punchlines that I'm sharing with you. Okay, so if you're wondering too, Andrew, you're rushing through a lot of this stuff. You introduce these 2 ways of thinking about militarization. You're talking about nation states. Where do they fall? if we're thinking of different nations here. So this is just a very simple, table that arranges from low to high military participation rate, low to high, our relative, size measure, and our military expenditures per soldier major, getting the capital intensiveness of militaries to get a sense of where nations might fall. And this is based upon our data in our panel data sets. And Canada, for example, falls right here, where a relatively low participation rate. We have a relatively small military, okay? But we have a rather capital intensive military. So we have a small, technologically advanced military. We'll see what happens within the next couple of years with this increase in military spending, if that might move us, into a different one of these cells. These are imperfect. This is just to give you a sense of where nations might fall. The United States, where I'm from, as you might expect, incredibly high military expenditures per soldier. In terms of participation rate, just kind of in the middle, okay? Given how this is measured. Remember, it's a measure of the relative size of militaries. And if you're curious, what about nations where they're really big and really capital intensive? Examples would be Israel and Saudi Arabia, just to give you a sense of where nations might fall. Okay, some analyses, some findings. So these two figures here are the result of estimating the long run effects of these two military characteristics on the total emissions, carbon emissions for a sample of 104 nations over a 30-year time period. And so these figures here are plotting out the immediate effects and then the cumulative effects and the overall long run effects with the point estimates and the confidence intervals and all that sort of stuff. But you can see that both of these militarization characteristics do have immediate and cumulative and long run effects on national carbon emissions, okay? And if you're wondering, are these effect sizes trivial? Well, if we do some very simple back of the envelope calculations based upon our analysis with our data, it shows that a 1% increase in military expenditures per soldier for all of these nations combined would lead to a combined increase in their emissions of, well, 4,268,000 kilotons, right? It's pretty similar for a 1% increase in their participation rate. It would lead to a long run increase in their combined emissions of 5.6 million kilotons. And if you look at the United States as a whole in 2020, it's right in the middle of those two, okay? So these are not trivial effect sizes. So you're probably thinking, well, Andrew, what are the explanations for this? You haven't really talked to us much at all about theory. You said you're informed by theory and big thinkers. I'm going to get there in a minute. But I wanted just to point out for those of you that are into methods and models, this is what kind of a basic model looks like here. And if you're curious, how are these long run coefficients estimated? This is why we use these kind of basic ARDL models here. And I just want to credit Ryan Toombs. We use a lot of their really interesting and useful commands and data to estimate long run effects and to make these kinds of figures, these long run, they're publicly available commands. If you use these kinds of data, I highly recommend his tools. Okay, but explanations, because we're arguing that the evolving conditions associated with the capital intensiveness and relative size of militaries shape these sorts of path dependencies that structure short-run and long-run effects on nations' carbon emissions. It's sort of a grand statement, right? Well, we think that there are various mechanisms and pathways through which this is occurring. For one, there's a clear power argument here about coercive power. So nations with larger and more technologically advanced militaries are utilizing their coercive power to secure and maintain access to energy and other natural resources. This has been going on a long time. There's a power dynamic at play here, for sure. Also, in the contemporary area, if you think of the never-ending arms race and the increasing focus on, are any of you familiar with the concept of risk transfer militarism? Think drones. Drones, IT, logistics, all of that kind of stuff. And it's a never-ending times of arms race, and it's very technologically advanced. And it often, in theory, allows for the displacing of risk. Well, this is very energy intensive as it continues to evolve, and the amount of energy that's used just to maintain this, right? And also just think of the scale of military, think of their infrastructure, think of all the bases, the big ones, the small ones, and even the little ones that are called lily pads that are all over the world. They use a lot of natural resources. They use a lot of fuel directly and for adjacent purposes, which I'll get to in a few minutes. This is referred to more broadly within environmental sociology. We have a theory called the treadmill destruction theory. Some of you might have heard of treadmill production theory, which focuses on kind of capitalism and economic growth. And you might get a sense just by treadmill production. Treadmill destruction is focusing explicitly on the world's militaries as social institutions, as these treadmill-like, never-ending, evolving social institutions that have unique social and environmental consequences. But they're also, of course, deeply interacting with the state and the private sector. Okay, and to get very specific, what they use is not energy efficient. Many would argue that these are pretty old. Many would consider to be conservative estimates of the amount of fossil fuels that are burned by jets, helicopters, whether it be by land, sea, or air. They're using a lot of fossil fuels. And there's also these broader geopolitical dynamics at play where militaries throughout the world consider climate change to be a threat multiplier, but there's really interesting research in political science and political sociology that has shown that nations with larger and more powerful militaries tend to be slower to ratify different kinds of environmental agreements, including climate agreements. So these are just to kind of wet your whistle on some of the different mechanisms. Okay, now moving on to how this is evolving. So this is in a paper that was published in the American Sociological Review pretty recently, where we are asking these questions about, well, do these characteristics of militarization amplify or just serve as moderators to shape the association between economic growth and carbon emissions? The answer is yes, they appear to. And so this figure here is plotting out, it's a three-way interaction between these two military characteristics and GDP per capita to get at the effects of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions for this large sample of nations during the 1990 to 2016 time period. And so in this figure here from left to right, this is plotting out the elasticity coefficient for the effect of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions as both of these militarization characteristics go from 10th percentile to the median to the 90th percentile. And so you see here going from left to right, for nations that have relatively larger military participation rates, and those that have a higher military expenditures per soldier, the estimated effect of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions is higher. I've gone against the advice of my old statistics teachers that told me to stay away from three-way interactions because they can make you nauseous and dizzy, but we think that this is an important thing to do. If you're curious, the two-way interactions are all statistically significant as well, but we like to focus on the three-way interaction. Now, based upon this kind of analysis and a lot of other analysis that we do in this paper, we do a counterfactual type of exercise where we think of two different hypothetical world scenarios versus what really is occurring in our data set. And so this line here in the middle through time is just average per capita carbon emissions through time for the nations in our data set in the middle. Based upon our analysis and using our models and our findings, this upper line here is what a hypothetical world of high militarization would look like, where all nations had 90th percentile militarization for both of these military characteristics. This is where we'd be, perhaps, in that hypothetical world in terms of average per capita carbon emissions. Okay, so on the bottom, in a low militarization world, you see things would be quite different. This just suggests to substantively these are not trivial effects. Okay? Okay. So, like Andrew, what's the story here? Some of you are probably already thinking, you're talking about the global military industrial complex. You're kind of dancing at and trying to get at this using these sorts of tools and models and imperfect data. And we think that that's largely what we're tapping into here. The idea of the rise of the world's militaries leading to modern forms of militarization that shape carbon-intensive growth in national and international economies through contracts for R&D and production and support. I should mention that I grew up in a Lockheed family. And if you're familiar with Lockheed, that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about that. I should say that my mother was not a scientist for, or an engineer for Lockheed, but worked in human resources for a number of years before they felt uncomfortable and changed and worked for startups. A common story in Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s. Okay, but more directly though, we're talking about this so-called permanent war economy dynamic that's embedded in the global military industrial complex, the continual preparation for conflicts and the desire to maintain security, national and international and global security and geopolitics and all of that just increases and propels the scale intensity of these kinds of economic activities within the defense industry, but also adjacent private sector areas too, okay? Even just think about what happens near bases and installations and how they can affect local economies in different ways that can have environmental impacts. Think of all the production systems and supply chains, right? Within the defense industry and other adjacent industries that are embedded within the global military industrial complex, all the energy and natural resources and carbon that is as a result of all of this, okay? And some of you might be familiar with literature that's been around a long time that focuses on how militaries, there's many examples of how they've been able to minimize risk for different industries throughout history, right? Where industry can benefit from the application of different technologies, often initially designed for military purposes that end up as commercial products. Large vehicles, SUVs, Humvees. How popular were Humvees in Canada when they came out? Did they have a big spike in sales like they did where I used to live? But you probably think of Humvees, but you could think of other things too. Internet, IT technology, the science and logistics, and all of that, which makes Amazon so good at getting you things so quickly. Yeah. Okay. I think you get the gist of the underlying arguments we think help suggest all of this stuff. Okay, moving on. So carbon load displacement. And this is also largely a power argument. So we begin with the argument that is not a unique argument to us, but the broad argument that access to fossil fuels and natural resources and cheap labor is beneficial for corporations and transnational capital, kind of critical economic globalization 101, observation. And I mean that in an important way. We suggest that military coercive power to some extent facilitates and maintains such access for them. That's sort of our argument here that turns into an empirical question, where explicitly we suggest that a reliance on inward foreign direct investment from more militarily powerful nations is a structural condition that helps facilitate and maintain carbon load displacement and this overall outsourcing of environmental harms, especially to global South nations that are heavily reliant or dependent on inward foreign investment. Some of you might be familiar with the foreign investment debates that have been around for a long time in economics and sociology. So clearly we're kind of stepping into, well, we've been involved in these debates for a long time. My mentor, Christopher Chase Dunn, was involved in these debates 50 years ago, for example, debates about investment dependency and all of that kind of stuff. That literature still exists, and it's changed a lot in recent years, where a big push in the literature, interdisciplinary, has been to say, hey, maybe we should take more of a relational approach. Well, yeah, maybe the amount of foreign investment and what sectors it's in might matter for a range of reasons, but maybe we also need to think about where the foreign investment is coming from and where it's going. We theorize about it. There's a lot of really great in-depth case studies and comparative historical work on that, but how can we bring that into quantitative modeling? And so that's part of our intervention here to say, okay, relationally, we should look at relationships and power dynamics within these relationships. And this is how we try to do it. So we came up with this measure, and I should mention my collaborator and co-author and current graduate student extraordinaire, Taekyung Go, has been a really big part of this work. So we create this measure using relational foreign investment data, network data. And I know some of you in the room are experts in network analysis. And so we're using network data on foreign investment from sending and receiving nations. We have this simple calculation for those of you that like simple calculations. You can see it's a basic idea, right? But overall, this allows us to quantify the relative extent to which inward foreign investment stocks for a receiving nation are sent from nations with higher military expenditures per soldier. So it's a broad, comprehensive measure that captures this for us. So if we use this as our independent variable in these autoregressive distributive lag models, while controlling for a bunch of things, including just the standard measure of overall inward FDI effects, we see that it actually matters. So for two different CO2 emissions outcomes, because in all these studies, by the way, I should have mentioned, we look at 3 different CO2 emissions outcomes: total emissions, per capita emissions, and emissions per unit of GDP, for a range of substantive and theoretical reasons. And I want to note that our findings are substantively consistent, regardless of which type of emissions outcome we use. But we don't treat them all as the same thing, because they're not. They have really important meanings in and of themselves, right? I just wanted to point that out. So you've seen these sorts of figures on some prior slides, so you know what they're plotting out, but you can see there are immediate and cumulative and long-run effects. They're not big, they're not huge, okay? But they're not trivial either. So this is capturing, because these are the elasticity coefficients, so this is capturing that to some extent, this type of military coercive power dynamic to some extent is shaping this type of carbon load displacement, perhaps, that occurs via inward forward investment and this transnational organization of production dynamic. Absolutely. And I'm just going to check my time while you, oh, how am I on time? Are we doing okay? Oh, wow. Okay. I've been talking pretty fast. I had a lot of coffee. I'll slow down a little bit or ask some questions, please. I'm not going to drink any more coffee. Yeah, back? Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just having trouble wrapping on.
Okay. So these are the immediate effects, the elasticity coefficient, and then the cumulative elasticity coefficients for the effect of this. It's a really wonky name for this variable, but our weighted FDI measure that's weighted by cumulatively military expenditures per soldier of sending nations. So this is telling you that a 1% increase in that is leading to an immediate increase by this much. These are elasticity coefficients here in immediate effect. And then here's the cumulative effects. And you can see for sure that there's, it's referred to as decay, right, in the literature, that the period effects year by year are getting smaller and smaller. So we see some decay, but you see the immediate effect and the cumulative effect and the overall long-term effect of this. But this is measuring the estimated effect in a regression model of, we know that out of the things, or I think that out of the things that I've shared with you this far today, this is probably the clunkiest one to wrap your mind around. And we know that. And we've been trying to figure out how can we articulate this. And I'm going to get to this towards the end, because why we're thinking about how can we articulate this more clearly, because it is pretty clunky. Like, this is very insider baseballish. Folks in the FDI literature are like, oh yeah, we get this. And some folks are into it and think, yeah, this is a great idea. And others are like, no, this is not a good idea. Yeah. Any other questions right now? Clarification questions? Okay. All right. So, I didn't know if I'd get to this. So this is the 4th study that I was going to mention. And this is where we're focusing on the direct relationship between US military spending and direct energy consumption for the US Department of Defense. So this is time series analysis stuff using what's most common in literature now, where we estimate some error correction models for time series data from 1975 to 2022. Okay, and this is just plotting out descriptively what some of these data here look like, where we have overall energy consumption, and then we're able to break it up into a couple of broad categories, especially facilities and vehicle and equipment. And you can see that, they're kind of going in different directions relative to what military expenditures look through time. And I know we stop at 2020, and we know that if it went on, like, this is going up, and yeah. Anyway, okay. So what we find that we think is really quite telling in some ways and really important is, for one, we find evidence of statistical asymmetry. Are any of you familiar with the concept of statistical asymmetry broadly? We're often in regression models, right? We assume in a basic regression model that if you have a coefficient that's like positive in 0.5, and it suggests that a 1% increase in something leads to a 0.5% increase in that, and then you kind of treat that it's a symmetrical effect, which would mean that a 1% decrease in that would lead to a 0.5%. Yeah, that's symmetry. Well, oftentimes we treat things as symmetrical, and they may not actually be symmetrical in their effects. So what we find here is statistical asymmetry in a very interesting way. We find that actually a decrease in expenditures appears to have a larger effect on decreasing energy consumption, direct energy consumption for the US military, than an increase in expenditures does on increasing consumption, based upon, no pun intended, torturing the heck out of these data with these models. Or I should say Ryan did a lot of the torturing. And when we kind of dive into this, we see that this applies both for facility level energy consumption as well as vehicles and equipment, but it's especially for jet fuel in particular. Well, think about how energy intensive jet fuel is and think about how many jets the US military has and how often they're being used on the daily basis. If you've ever lived near a military installation for the US, you often hear and you see a lot of jets every day, right? So we could probably think of maybe even some basic accounting reasons why this effect occurs, right? But we think that this is really meaningful and actually is, pretty relevant for what might be going on now in Canada and where things might be headed in Canada. But to really illustrate this too, based upon our analysis, we do some forecasting with different scenarios. And the punchline is that if military spending for the US decreased by just 6.5%, just by 6.5%, it would still be enormous, by far bigger than anywhere else in the world, by far. It could lead to a decrease in energy consumption annually that is on par with what the nation of Slovenia consumes in its entirety. And Slovenia is not a trivial case. If you look at, and I mean, sorry, I spent a lot of time in Lithuania at Vilnius University, and so that was like a bad, sorry, insider joke. Slovenia is not trivial. If you get a cross section of data, national level data on energy consumption, overall energy consumption, arrange them from low to high, Slovenia is right around the median, the 50th percentile. Okay. And we're not talking about Slovenia's military energy consumption. We're talking about Slovenia as a whole. Yeah, we think it's pretty telling. Okay, so this was where up until this morning, I was going to spend some time talking about how, hey, Canada, hey, Canadian government, hey, the reality of geopolitics and NATO and the world is complicated and messy, and we've been dealing with these major pressures, geopolitical pressures to increase our military capacity and military spending. We need to keep in mind the energy and climate consequences of this, especially since we're hearing too that part of this is a big push to focus on domestic industries and investing in and domestic industry for a lot of really important reasons, right? But this is messy and complicated stuff, and there are perhaps unintended energy and climate consequences. There are people in the media here in Canada that have been making these kinds of arguments or observations recently, and some of them have heard about my colleagues and I and have been asking us what we think. And we're like, we would love to be able to, for example, do this kind of analysis for Canada if we could find the data. And I wanted to bring this up because if anyone has any ideas on where we could get nuanced data for military spending and energy consumption directly tied to military activities in Canada, we would love to do this kind of analysis with these kinds of projections because we think that, yeah, like basic science reasons, but also there might be some policy reasons why this might be a good thing to do. And of course, for many other nations around the world. Okay, so conclusion though, I kind of walked you through very quickly the summaries of these 4 papers. 3 of the 4 papers are very long and wordy because I'm a social scientist and we are long and wordy in our social science articles. So a lot of the detail that I didn't go over today are in all of those papers. If you'd like copies or if you'd like to just hang out and talk over coffee about what's the real story behind the stuff, the causal mechanisms, and have a friendly debate or conversation, I would love to do that with any of you. Because this is still a very ongoing project because we are now starting a book on this that is now under, we just got a contract, not with our press, but with Columbia University Press in the US, and part of a series that does work on environment, a social science series that we're supposed to get done by January. And within that, though, we're going to do these kinds of analyses, but we're going to update them to 2025. And also, we're going to include, without question, multiple case studies to really dive into and get at the nitty-gritty of these mechanisms and the extent to which they are similar across cases, as well as how they might be different within cases. So stay tuned Hopefully there will be a book that gives a coherent story about all of this, but we certainly have some more work to do to get there. I have a feeling I might have finished in less than 30 minutes because I'm done. Thank you for listening. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah.